Okay, good afternoon, everyone. James Scullen here from the Australia-China Business Council. Thanks a lot for joining another one of our national briefings. Today, we're looking to explore the impact of COVID-19 on the tourist sector. And we have the best people to speak to about that in Andrew Hogg from Tourism Australia and Emma McDonald from Austrade. But before we begin by speaking with our panelists today, just a few housekeeping matters. We like to make these events as interactive as possible. So if you have a look at the bottom of your screen, you can see that there's a Q&A section. If you just want to type a concise question there at any time during today's session, we've allocated plenty of time for discussion. So we'll look to get as many of those as possible, but please try and make them concise so we can get through as many as we can. And also, I should let you know that today's session is being recorded. So should we have any issues with the feed or bandwidth at all, we'll be posting this session on the ACBC website next week, and you'll be able to share that with any of your colleagues or clients as well. Okay, great. So our first speaker today is Emma McDonald, who is the industry specialist for tourism infrastructure from Austrade. And Emma's going to give us an overview of the federal government's response to COVID-19 and the tourism sector. So over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Emma McDonald. I'm with Austrade. I lead the tourism infrastructure part of the business with regard to investment. And I'd just like to acknowledge the difficulties that many of you may be going through at the moment with regard to the effective shutdown of tourism around the world, and just be aware that we're hearing a lot of very traumatic stories about how businesses and people are going as part of our role here at Austrade. So our thoughts are with you at this time. I just thought I'd give a bit of an overview. I'm not going to talk for very long because I think many of you will have questions. I understand also that you heard from one of my colleagues, Rebecca Hall, last week on the international education space. I work pretty closely with Rebecca on issues to do with the visitor economy, and we're looking to work together even more closely during this time. But just as a bit of an overview, Austrade and Tourism Australia are working together on both tourism survival mechanisms and also some recovery initiatives as part of a broad Australian government response. As part of intelligence gathering, we are speaking to a lot of businesses. They're telling us what they're going through. We're recording these impacts and we're reporting those through to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, Minister Simon Birmingham and his team. The state and territory governments are also very much involved in responses to the tourism industry. And there's a fair bit of assistance that has been rolled out over the last couple of weeks. And it seems like a lot longer than that, things are moving so fast. But probably the best resource out there for tourism businesses is the Tourism Australia website, tourism.australia.com. There's a particular page there that you can go to and have a look at all the different government programs, both at the federal level and state and territory government level. It includes such things as the dedicated $1 billion fund to support sectors, regions and communities that are disproportionately affected by coronavirus. And it includes those heavily reliant on industries such as tourism, agriculture and education. And there's also other things such as details about the $130 billion JobKeeper payment, which may be relevant to a lot of tourism businesses. There's also a couple of initiatives that Austrade has been directly involved in. One is the $110 million International Freight Assistance Mechanism, which was announced last week. Granted, that doesn't have much to do with passenger movements at the moment, but it is a way of helping keep some planes in the sky. At the moment, it aims to support Australia's high-value agricultural and seafood export sectors to access key global markets, with the return flights bringing in medical supplies, which are fairly critical at the moment. And the other program that we are directly invested in is the additional $49.8 million into export market development grants, which allows businesses to claim the full 50% of their international marketing costs for the 2019-20 financial year. And if any of you or any of your clients have put forward a submission under that fund, we're pleased to say that money's been made available to fully cover that 50% portion of expenditure, and it's being fast-tracked at the moment. However, all that aside, the biggest issue that we're seeing is just how many businesses will be able to see out the next 6 to 12 months. We've been speaking to a lot of businesses, as has Tourism Australia. We're aware that a lot have rising debts and no revenue coming in. It's a really difficult period of time and history for the sector. I'm also fairly close to the hotel sector, given my infrastructure bent, and as you all know, is acutely affected as well. And given the amount of recent hotel investment in Australia as well, there are a lot of hotel investors that only recently entered the sector. Many of them are fairly highly leveraged, and without cash flow will find recovery particularly hard as well. Industry's telling us that due to the impacts of border closures and the availability of international air access, that they expect recovery will be domestic-led for a while. So with regard to the China market, that will come. However, it probably won't be immediately something easy to deal with, just given international borders seem to be closed in a number of different places. However, given the importance of international education to the sector, we're acutely aware of how critical it will be to see the return of the Chinese visitor, both for leisure and education. And we're working through some of those problems at the moment. In terms of my business, we are very busy in trying to help formulate government responses that will help the industry, both in the survival stage and next into the recovery stage as well, and would welcome any ideas that people on the call might have as well, because we're not the, we're not the source of all good ideas. So if anyone would like to contact me following this call, very open to having a discussion about that. Would love to hear from you. And we'll also be, or I'll be leading a community of practice over the next couple of months to try to bring in both the private sector, government, and universities to try to help direct Austrade's work for the recovery of tourism for the next few months. There'll be a number of unknowns though, in particular what the new normal will look like once we're out of this immediate medical crisis mode. And it's still a bit unknown as to what the short to medium term is going to look like, and in particular what consumer preferences and consumer sentiment might be. So in that regard, I'd like to hand over to Andrew Hogg, one of my colleagues in Tourism Australia, to provide some insights on the likely outlook for tourism and what businesses might be able to do to position themselves in the recovery. So thank you, James. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you very much, James, for having me today. And it's great and a good opportunity to talk to the ACBC and the members around, more specifically around China. And I look after the North Asia region, which is China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And I live in Shanghai, but I've unfortunately been stuck in Sydney now for a couple of months with my family. And it's obviously a very difficult time, not only for our industry, but also for our industry partners in China as well, who have, particularly our aviation partners, our distribution partners in market. And what we're seeing currently is, and I think on the ground there, and some statistics coming out of what's there and what's actually gone on. So immediately, business is getting back on the ground in China, and there's an activity index which is at about 80% at the moment for large enterprises, and small enterprises is a little bit worse than that just at this stage, what we're seeing, particularly around, I think, the travel industry, where in China, and the consumer has been in a period of isolation, not only in Wuhan, and the surrounds of Wuhan, but in Shanghai, Beijing, in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, all over China. Everyone's been in an isolation and hibernation period at home, which has been for an extended period as China first battled the COVID-19. What that has done is it's dented the tourism industry in China, from both a domestic and an outbound. And the outbound was, if we go back to, I think it was the 27th of January, when China actually issued a stop on all group travel and then all FIT travel, and then told their citizens that only essential travel should be taken abroad. That was in the response to many people from China who'd been going overseas, who had been ill and then required medical attention offshore. And also China was obviously looking at its roles and responsibilities with regard to that as well. So immediately it was that the tourism tap from China was turned off. And that was felt extensively throughout our industry in a time that was during the Lunar New Year, during CNY, and that is the busiest time. In Australia, tourism relies heavily on Chinese visitation, and it was looking like a good year in terms of our numbers. Chinese New Year was late in January, so it didn't cross over too much with the Australian school holidays, and we were looking forward to a very good season, but it was certainly stopped in its tracks there. So on the ground in China, our travel industry partners, we have 36 key distribution partners in market, and obviously with the major airlines, not only in Australia, but also in China, with China Eastern, Air China and China Southern, our largest and most valuable partners, and particularly China Southern, with nearly 30% of the capacity into Australia, flying to Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. The impact was felt enormously on the ground in China, as well as here. Our travel industry partners, we've had extensive discussions and continue to talk to them. Myself personally and my team who are in China, in our three major offices that we have in China. Tourism Australia has a central office in Shanghai. We have an office in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Chengdu as well. So we've continued to engage with our travel industry partners, to work with them. And we're at that stage where we're doing a lot of planning with them about a return to market. Now, the $64 million question, when is that going to be? I don't have the answer. It would be great to be able to know and to be able to see where that's currently going, but it's a health emergency, and it doesn't give us the rules around when borders will open and when things will return to normal. So we continue to work with our partners, who are very understanding about what's going on the ground in Australia, because they're seeing it globally as well. So we have galvanised, as I said, the industry and our aviation partners, but in the meantime, we still haven't stopped talking to the consumer. We haven't turned off our social channels. In fact, we changed the tone of our social channels. We did during the height of probably the last couple of weeks, we were doing things like how to cook like an Australian at home, using Australian produce, those sorts of things that were engaging. And the feedback we got from that was great, because people are saying, I'm sick of the isolation. I'm looking to the outside world. Even though I can't travel, they're looking for that dreaming phase or that inspiration phase, which certainly then feeds the funnel for the tourism and our conversion. And we continue to do that now. We continue to train the travel agents in China as well. And we do that now. We switch platforms, and we're using WeChat as a platform to train travel agents. So we have 15,000 trained travel agents that have done face-to-face training. And it's important that we continue to engage with them. And it's very important that we continue to talk about Australia, the great products, the great opportunities that Australia has to offer. We're also taking the opportunity to upskill, and we're providing many online courses for those travel agents, which goes to a point system, so that they keep their qualifications as an Aussie specialist or a premium Aussie specialist in our top tier membership category. So it's something that we continue to do. We've been rolling out a series, and this is not just for China, but now globally as well, a series of social posts that continue to talk to our consumers offshore. And it's that message showing that, although the Great Barrier Reef and the fish are taking a rest and Uluru taking a deep breath at the moment, we look forward to welcoming people back. And that's the continued message that we've gone out there with social. In terms of large media play, it's very difficult out there at the moment, and more than 90% of global travel companies have reduced expenditure or ceased marketing entirely as well. But we continue to engage our consumers and our followers through social channels, and whether that be through Weibo or through WeChat, Instagram or Twitter, we continue to do that as well. We understand, and we've had a series of our own webinars, and one was held today, and you can review that on tourism.australia.com at any stage if you wanted to see some more information, particularly for our industry, around mental health, and also what is available for in terms of government assistance with the various jobs packages that have been recently announced from the government as well. But I can assure you that we're not standing still in our market. Our offices are open and continuing to engage with trade, consumer and aviation. That we continue to develop a new campaign, which we have developed, and we were developing that at the height of the crisis with the number of key influencers that we had here in Australia. I won't go into who they were. We don't want to give that up just yet. And I've just been viewing some of the short edits from that as well. And that's really about the story that Australia has to tell. We know the Chinese consumer seeks unique experiences, and that they want to travel around the world. And we know that when it comes back, that consumer, that free independent traveller from China will return. They will continue to seek those experiences, and will continue to market those unique experiences that Australia has to offer. So, at the end of the day, it's no longer about, what Australia is. It's really about what uniqueness Australia has, from our wildlife to our food and wine to our coastal and aquatic regions that we have in Australia. So we continue to work through those extensively. In terms of what's on the ground, and particularly with travel agents, we talked about consolidation with some of the major travel agencies in China, and I'm sure that will continue, and those discussions will continue. And now that we've got a global slowdown in all areas of tourism has ground to a halt, we know that the Chinese travel agents are now looking at what they do from an offer going forward. Australia is seen as a very safe destination in terms of its environment, its built environment, its metro, and also the wonderful experiences that they have here. So we know that Australia will stay top of mind, and we know that people will keep dreaming about returning to Australia. And to quote a very good friend of mine in Hangzhou, who works in the tech industry there, he said, "I've been to Australia 3 times. He sent me a quick note to just make sure I was okay, because I was making sure he was okay during all of this and reaching out. But one of the things that he came back with is, I know I've been to Australia 3 times, and people think they know Australia, but every time I come back, I find something new, and I will be back soon. And as soon as the doors open, I know that he and his family will come to Australia and have those great experiences as well." So I can assure you that we're not standing still in terms of what we're doing with the consumer. We will continue to work closely with the consumer, our trade and our aviation partners going forward. And that my team in China are very, very engaged, and the Tourism Australia globally is very engaged in making sure that we get a return when we possibly can as well on that. So I think that's just a bit of a brief summary on where we're at with China, and we know that the consumer is looking at where to go next and what to do, and they'll go through some planning phases. But at the moment, they're getting back to a routine, returning to their workplaces and to the cities where they're from, and getting back into that. Education is a high priority in China as well. Many of the schools in many of the larger provinces are still closed at this stage. We know that they will look to reopen that in the near future. But does that change the summer holiday period? Will borders be open? I don't know the answers to that. But it will still continue to be top of mind for us as we track the consumer, and we work through a green light project to ensure that when the borders do open and when people are ready to travel again and when it's safe to travel again, that we'll be at the forefront of that, and that we will be the leading national tourism organisation in China. And we've got some great partners, not only in Australia in the industry, but also in China with the industry and our aviation partners to move forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Emma, both for your presentations. Andrew, if I can just ask you, you touched on obviously the importance of the aviation sector. I was just wondering if you could give us some information about the breakdown of the Chinese domestic aviation sector. As of December, there were 156 flights between Australia and China, flying out of 18 Chinese airports to 7 Australian airports. I just wanted to ask 2 questions. The first being, to what extent do you see the Chinese government propping up a lot of these smaller carriers like Xiamen and Sichuan that were quite prevalent flying into Australia? And the second question would be, when things do start up again, do you see it being at the same proportionate level it was in terms of the breadth of carriers flying into Australia, or do you see it being more centralised around the larger Air China's, China Southern?
James, it's a very good question. I think the first part is really around an aviation-led recovery strategy that we're working through at the moment, because without aviation, it's obviously impossible to get people to come to Australia. So looking at the front end and how we work through that strategy at the moment, and we've had engaged with our state and territory tourism organisations and our major airports in Australia, and we continue to engage with them on a daily basis, but also on a very structured approach to look at the priorities of each of the markets, the priorities of what we've got in terms of carriers. And when we talk about the 3 major carriers in China, not only was there a dent on their outbound travel at what is their peak and where they make a significant amount of their profit for the year is in that Chinese New Year period, their domestic market was also taken down, exactly the same as what's happened in Australia. Demand just fell to virtually zero, and that's been devastating for them. The Chinese government, for the 3 major carriers, came out with a bailout package and supporting their balance sheets along the way, and then made a number of different regulatory changes in market to be able to suit that the domestic carriage as well. So splitting up each market and determining which carrier would fly each one. In terms of the secondary cities and the second tier airlines like Xiamen, for example, well, Xiamen's already got a very high ownership from China Southern Airlines. And I probably would imagine that in the future, some of those airlines, the larger airlines, will increase their ownership of those airlines. And going back historically, looking at the linkages there, Xiamen was set up by the Fujian government as a way that they could promote Fujian as a province. Then through consolidation and further consolidation and selling through to China Southern. So China Southern have that now as one of their brands that they promote. So I think there'll be some tighter linkages there. In terms of the capacity, and you're right, from I think it was nearly 19 cities to 7 cities in Australia, you could fly from 19 cities in China to Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Cairns at one point in time, and Darwin with Donghai Airlines out of Shenzhen too. So they will still play a role, and I think from those second tier cities. However, a lot of those routes for those airports were subsidised by local government. And subsidised, for example, out of Xiamen, also out of Xi'an as well, where we'd seen some of those carriers were subsidised. Chongqing was a subsidy route, Kunming to supplement the airport there. So I would say that the local government probably makes some changes, whether they are to continue to support, depending on the economic circumstances of that particular province as well. So I think there will be consolidation, and this has been discussed globally as well. There will be consolidation, contraction within the aviation industry globally. China's not immune to that, and they will act in a more commercial manner. I think into the future that they will be able to ensure that their survival is paramount as well, because I think China Southern has more than 1,000 planes and more than 100,000 staff employed. So they're a very significant business and employer in China. So they'll need to protect their balance sheet and work them. But we're also working closely with Southern, Eastern and Air China to make sure that Australia is at the forefront of a return of aviation capacity. We talk about the three major cities, and out of eastern China, out of Zhejiang, Jiangsu and Shanghai province, there represents nearly a quarter of Australia's tourism just from those three major provinces. So, it's important for us that we restore not only the direct linkages, but also the capacity, and you can do that through frequency as well. So we're working very closely with those carriers for a return. And our job is to build the demand at the front end, to demonstrate to the airlines why they should return, and also into the future, what does that mean for them in terms of Tourism Australia's ability to be able to generate more and more traffic for them as well, and we continue to do that.
Do you think within China that there will be a priority to help boost the domestic Chinese tourism industry first before looking to outbound international travel to places like Australia? Has the central government in China, do they have a policy in place now as China slowly goes back to work to increase domestic travel? Is China at that stage yet?
Yeah, they are. And I think, similar to what we did after the bushfires, and Tourism Australia ran a campaign of holiday here this year. And we want Australians to holiday in Australia because of the great places that we have. China has sought to do the same. And they've had that policy over the last 3 years. They made a number of policy changes through the State Council that had been really around tweaking and incentivising provinces to up their tourism game. So tourism standards, better hotels, and also, getting the tourism, the travel trade in China to promote itself, to promote the product as well. So that will continue. The most natural reaction, and very similar to what I mentioned in Australia, if you're looking at a return to travel, it would be, self-drive would be your number one, inside your own borders, obviously. And then the return then of domestic tourists flying, then a return to international, probably in that order. And China's no different. If you're living in Shanghai, you might take a day trip to Westlake in Hangzhou, spend some time there, maybe overnight, come back to Shanghai, and people will start to do that on that basis. However, there was an article I picked up last week about the Great Wall, and the Great Wall has about 15 locations that are the best viewing and the ones that are sort of the authorised viewing places of the Great Wall. And don't ask me to name them all. I think I've been to 2 of them. But in those areas, they've already capped the number of people that can go to some of these places by 30%, because they're still trying to practice social distancing and doing the right thing there too. So it is a slow return to market. However, that preference for the domestic, I think, is consumer-led, but there was some policy changes that enabled it. I think last year it was nearly a 9% growth in domestic tourism in China. Now, that's not a bad thing for Australia, because if someone was starting out from a tier 2 or a tier 3 city about tourism, traveling somewhere in your own country first, then possibly going on to do something within your region, maybe to Thailand, or to going to Japan, or do something on a local, an hour and a half, 2 hour flight. And then following on from that, starting to go further afield and coming to places like Australia, where as that tourist grows, that they feel more confident to communicate and navigate within Australia or internationally as well. And that's the opportunity that comes with that.
Fantastic.
The Chinese consumers' insatiable appetite for going abroad, I don't think will change.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's hope so. Thank you, Andrew. Now, I think one of the first questions to come through is from our Queensland branch, from Wen. Emma, this might be best directed to yourself. With regards to the $110 million federal initiative, is there any way we know how the fund is distributed, who's eligible to receive it, and whether the fund is available to cargo carriers? Whether you could give us any insight into that.
Sure, I can give you a brief insight at the moment. So that $110 million is it's more of a subsidy scheme for exporters. What our priority is at the moment is in sourcing carriers to be able to undertake those freight routes, and it is going out to tender. There's been an expression of interest process from which started last week, and airlines can bid for certain routes, and that's underway at the moment. I can't talk in any more detail about that just because that process is underway. However, if there's any specific questions, do get in touch with me and I can put you onto the right team within Austrade so that they can give you a specific response. But as mentioned, at the moment, it is very much focused on high value, low volume exports. And in particular, it is agricultural products and seafood. But there's also scope to look at other products if those if the bellies of those planes are not filled to capacity. So yeah, I expect it is mainly it is cargo planes.
Okay, great. Well, we have another question, and when would the China when would China restart the? I think the question means when can we plan for the China rebound? I think to go easier on you guys with a question that's very difficult to answer, I might rephrase it in terms of when we do see a resumption of international travel to Australia, do you expect it to be proportionally similar? So I know that with Chinese tourists to Australia, the numbers annually were about 1.4, 1.5 million, and New Zealand was closely behind that. Do you see the numbers when they restart, do you see them being in proportion to what they were? Or is there a chance that, we could just have a total revolution in the way that, tourists have come to Australia and the numbers could be turned upside down? So maybe I'll ask you first, Emma, and then we'll go on to Andrew for that one.
Yeah, in terms of the data obtained about Chinese visitation to Australia, you might have been aware that at the end of last year there was a bit of a levelling off in the growth of the Chinese traveller. We believe that was mainly due to global economic conditions, because that was happening across the world rather than just in particular with Australia. I've read a few articles and I've heard from industry on what they expect. Andrew's probably in a better position to comment than I am. And at the end of last year, I think the International Visitor Survey is being released, probably without much fanfare at the moment, given the circumstances, but Chinese visitor growth was still in positive territory very much at the end of last year, so that's ending December. It's going to take a while to return to that sort of volume. However, I'll pass over to Andrew, who will be able to answer that a bit better than me.
I will unmute myself. There should be a pro at using Zoom by now. I just said the IVS, the International Visitor Statistics, have been released, and to no fanfare because it's backward facing. It was for the last quarter, and I've got some of the data here. I might be able to share that later on in the call, but it is available publicly. We had seen a slowdown in Chinese visitation over that last 12 months, and I think it was right. Some of the economic conditions globally were some headwinds globally around that, but also, we had a big surge because we'd grown our capacity, I think nearly by 19.5, nearly 20% of inbound airline capacity into Australia. And a lot of that, as James mentioned, was from some of the tier 2 cities out of China as well. So we'd seen a lot of capacity growth into Australia. And with that becomes airfares, and airlines continue to act irrationally during that particular period, probably acting more rationally now, but during that period that the large amount of discounting going on. So people were really fortunate that travel between Australia and China became very, very cheap from a Chinese tourism perspective. So there'd been a lot of recovery on that. The airlines over the last quarter of last calendar year were looking to bring up their yields. So some of the fare increases had come in, which then generally slows the demand cycle of it. But the headwinds on that. Now, if you're looking at a return to market, it would be a gradual return. It wouldn't go today. For the month of say it was to open in May, I think we normally get about 124,000 visitors in the month of May. You wouldn't expect 124,000. It'll be a gradual build-up. Much like how the airlines will probably return capacity, is key capital cities routes first, and look at the tier 2 cities in both countries and how would they manage that. And then it's building up frequency. At some points during the year, we nearly have triple daily from Guangzhou to Melbourne, or Guangzhou to Sydney or Shanghai. It might start back at 1, grow to 2, grow to 3. But what our job is to do is to drive demand for the Chinese consumer, that they're preferencing up Australia and that they're actually buying it, and working with our distribution partners on that as well. So there will be a gradual build up. But again, the $64,000 question is when and by how much. At this stage, there's a lot of unknowns, but we are working through some modelling on that. Some people have put forward things like after SARS, but it's no comparison at this point in time about trying to compare that data. But we will, we're coming up with some modelling and some forecasting on that as well.
Thank you, Andrew and Emma. Now, just before we get to our next question, I'm just going to launch a poll here, just asking everyone on the call what they think the biggest challenges going forward will be for the tourism sector. So we'll check back on that poll in about 15 minutes, and I'll share those answers with you all. So our next question, I might be able to conflate these two. So Ashley asks, do you have any advice for tourism operators regarding ways to engage with KDPs and other Chinese partners during this time? And Thomas asks, what new innovations or approaches to the market can the industry learn from the crisis? Travel's very experiential experience, enjoyed in person, but are there any new ways of engaging with the market on a trade or customer level? So maybe a question about tourism operators first, any advice for them, and then a question about any innovative approaches that travel operators could consider.
Yeah. One of the things I think for, if I was a tourism operator here, I would make sure that I continue to engage with the travel trade and the travel partners, our key distribution partners, those KDPs in market. They're vitally important. I said this on a webinar today, that Tourism Australia, I said, just pick up the phone and say g'day. It's really simple. Check in with people. Although the industry is in crisis because of a global health emergency, people-to-people links are still vitally important. When many of my friends in China were going through the difficult period that they were going through, we picked up the phone, we wrote emails, we sent WeChats, we used all the technology there to reach out and talk to people. We had our chief executive, Philippa Harrison, write to the chairman and the CEOs of the major airlines, and each of them responded with, thank you for your concern. We'll work through this together. We're great partners. We look forward to continuing that relationship. And I think that those people-to-people links are really important. And if you don't engage with people and just expect it to come back, you might have a bit of a shock because someone else may have gotten in there as well. So I'd be picking up the phone, I'd be writing an email, I'd be dropping them a WeChat if you're connected on WeChat, and connect to your friends and just say good day and let them know that you're doing okay, and check in to see how they're going, and that we will be back, and we will be back better, and we'll be back stronger. And we look forward to welcoming them personally and all of their visitors that they want to bring as well. So as an operator, I think that's what I would be doing, is just reconnecting with them and making sure that you reach out to your friends.
Yeah, but I might just add to that, thanks Andrew, just in terms of domestic businesses, seeing through this period of time what opportunities there might be for digital capability within your operations. I think one lesson to be learned from the current crisis is the opportunities that having some digital infrastructure and some good communication methods will have into the future. So if there is an opportunity to capitalise on building up that digital capability and be more responsive to customer needs, which may change after this, we might have to be a bit more forward-leaning in terms of the safety of product and encouraging people to get out of their homes and travel a bit further afield, then let's take some of this time to foster some ideas as to really how to position the industry for that new normal.
So we've got a good question from James from WA. It's a question for Andrew. Has there been any sign of virtual tour or what they call cloud tourism, focused innovation with Chinese outbound agencies? And if there have been, has Tourism Australia considered its place in this?
Yeah, thanks and g'day, James. I think one of the things that we've been working through, and the industry's really taken a big lead on this, and if you have a look at what some of the zoos are doing with virtual tours at the moment, that people are reconnecting. So we've been promoting some of those things as well. There are people who are doing art lessons online. There are people who are, showing their product and doing tours, virtual tours, and we see a lot of that as well. Nothing replaces actually coming to see the product in the first place and coming to Australia and doing that. But in the absence of being able to do that, we must continue as an industry to promote Australia and show the best of Australia. So some of those virtual tours of zoos, you can log in 24/7 and check in on your favourite kangaroos and how they're going. But also we're getting great images and great footage through from the tourism industry in Australia, and we're promoting that through our social channels as well, saying, just to let you know that the kangaroos are doing okay and they miss you. There's those little things that people still want to engage with as well. And we've been using a lot of that through social, but as I said, we're also using we have our many other channels, and some of those are just Chinese specific channels in China. And we continue to promote Australia and promote those operators that are doing those things as well. So if anyone's out there as an operator who's doing something, please get in contact with our PR team and we'll make sure that we continue to promote it as well. So we are doing a lot of that virtual tourism things, and during this time. And I suppose if you go through the phase of where people sit at the moment, Australia went through the fear phase and the lockdown phase, and then there's rising optimism, and then there's the freedoms that you're given back and you can go forward and do that. And one of the things that China is now is in that rising optimism stage, and being able to go to work and be able to do those things. So they want to start engaging again more heavily with what we're doing. So we continue to promote those opportunities as well.
Andrew, just thinking about promotion and marketing, how important do you think safety is going to be in tourism messaging going forward in this new post-virus world that we'll be living in the future? I'm just thinking, we had Peter Doherty from the Doherty Institute on a call a few weeks ago, and we discussed the cultural differences between face masks in a country like Australia, where people tend not to really wear face masks, and in China it's mandatory to wear them. Could Chinese tourists potentially see Australia as dangerous to health, that Australian people walk around without face masks on, and just how that may play into greater safety marketing messages going forward?
Yeah, well, in China predominantly, people would wear masks for the pollution, coming to work, on the way home from work, and to do that. But safety is we do a number of consumer demand projects globally, and China is obviously key to that, considering it's our largest source market and largest expenditure market too. And we do a lot of like qualification of what's important to travellers, and safety and security are two of the highest things that are up there as well. It's always in the top 6 in China. In Japan, for example, it sits between 1 and 3 on how important that is. So, food, I think, is the number 1 out of China. I think food and unique wildlife are two of the biggest things that keep coming up as the top preference, and security sort of sits just underneath it. So it is upweighted, it is important, and we need to continue. I think Australia is currently in the midst of our health emergency, and the sooner we get out of it and demonstrate that we are continue to be a safe destination, that will play a long way into the consumers' minds as well.
Okay, I'm just reading another question we have here from Lavender. Any comments regarding the Australian-based Chinese community, given this market is significant by itself? Assuming the international travel ban may not be lifted in the near future, perhaps this market could be considered as a priority to reactivate. Any comments on whether the Chinese market could be considered a priority with reactivation? Emma, do you want to have a go at that one?
I think, I mean, China is at the forefront of our mind, just due to the links that we have, both as a trading partner, both as an international education destination and a tourism destination. Very important for us. So that is, in terms of markets, Tourism Australia is probably better placed than me, but in terms of a export destination, it is certainly a priority. I might hand over to you, Andrew. Sorry, I haven't answered that perfectly.
That's right. Thanks, Emma. Look, 83% of Australia's air freight is put on passenger aircraft too. So we also understand the importance of returning passenger aircraft, and that's why we're working on an aviation recovery and strategy. Depending on which market returns first is really entirely up to how the world copes with the global health emergency. As I said before, it could be that we end up in Australia where people will start out with a simple allowed to go for a drive and go to if you're in Queensland, you could go to the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast. If you're in Cairns, you could go to Townsville. If you're in New South Wales, you could go down to the South Coast and support some of the communities that have been ravaged by bushfires earlier in the year. Or Victoria, going out to the Grampians, for example. I could give you 1,000 examples around those sort of close drive ones. Then the next one would be people getting on planes and flying internally within Australia to have a tourism experience or a holiday. And then obviously as borders start to open, it would be really around what destinations and what those source markets have done in terms of COVID and what the destination has got to offer in terms of safety and security around COVID. So it's really a twofold. We're not just what Australia does, but also what's going on in that market. And if it continues in that way, and then, that's up to the health professionals to assess that and to make the determination at that particular time as well.
Andrew, can I just ask, you mentioned the importance of keeping in contact with Chinese partners and friends during this time. If you could just enlighten us on how Tourism Australia does that currently using Chinese platforms. Is it via WeChat? Is it via Weibo? Is it via the more domestic sites like Red Scarf and Melbourne Today? But if you could just give us some information about the methods that Tourism Australia is using to keep the Chinese traveller engaged at the moment?
Yeah, I think WeChat's pretty much the preferred method. Everything from payment to telling everyone what you're doing, talking to friends, videoing your friends. I think probably sitting here, I'll walk out, there'll be 20 WeChat messages waiting for me with different things. Some of them probably important. Other ones could be a joke. Other ones might be, telling me what's going on the ground. And WeChat is the main one. And I've got, 36 key distribution partners on one group. I've got different airlines in different groups as well. So you can do group messages. You can combine people up and send it out together because they're in the same boat. But, just a quick send through something that's, thinking of you on WeChat to one of your partners and checking in to see if they're okay, is really welcomed. And you'll get a response back because people live on WeChat in China. The phone's firmly in front of you and you want to do your WeChat straight away. So, I think that instant connection through that social media platform is really good. But I think the other thing too is pick up the phone and ring somebody. And then for some people, language might be an issue or might be a barrier. But if that isn't a barrier, then go ahead and do it. And if it is a barrier, try and find a way around it. There's always someone out who can help you with some translation, some simple translation. But and if not, send an email and just say good day. I think that's really what people want to hear, particularly from partners, about what's going on here in Australia and what's going on in China as well. And you'll get a good understanding of what's there. And I think that people-to-people connection is vitally important.
Okay, well, I think we might just have time for one more question here. Emma, I might give this one to you. This is from Dilshad. My question is is if TSWA would support hotels by arranging family groups in Western Australia to rebound tourism to China and other countries. I'm not sure what TCWA is, but Emily, you might have some more information on that.
I'm not sure if that relates to group travel, so through the ADS scheme. Certainly we're keeping a focus on remaining very relevant to the ADS scheme. It really comes down to the length of time that the current medical emergency is in place for. I think probably some of those type of organised links will be an opportunity to stimulate some of that initial travel, but it's just too early to say for the moment. I'd encourage you to get in touch with me, and I can probably answer it a bit better with the input of my colleagues. And we'd be looking for all sorts of ideas as to perhaps how to take advantages of some of those links, for sure.
Yeah, well, like I'm also being told that that's the Tourism Council of Western Australia, so I'd recommend getting in touch with that organisation directly, Dilshad. Okay, great. Well, so we just have a few minutes left. I might just publish the results of our poll. So hopefully that can be seen now. Well, yeah, unfortunately, xenophobia is seen to be one of the biggest challenges going forward, with increased international competition coming in second. Andrew, if I can just ask you, just a question about international competition. Do you feel countries are going to be reworking the wheel, in a sense, in terms of their strategies to attract Chinese tourists? Do you think it will be a stage one where countries will just re-engage with China in a different way? Or do you think countries like, our competitors like the USA and the UK will play more to their strength as they have been in the past? Or do you think we'll see new strategies when the rebound begins?
I think there'll be a lot of new strategies that will be employed. It's not without its competition. The Chinese traveller is a great traveller. They disperse well, they spend well, they eat out a lot, and I think that's really important for any tourism industry, and that's really where they're chasing. We know that at the end of this, that countries around the world will put more assistance into marketing their countries. So, whether it be the UK and Visit Britain, Tourism Australia, our efforts will be there, but we're not waiting for that to come. We're actually with regard to what we're doing, we're trying to get ahead of the curve and be in there now about talking to that consumer, although it's a very different tone that conversation's currently undertaking. But we also want to make sure that we're at the forefront of this, because we know that when countries turn around and turn their open borders again and aviation links are restored, that particularly the competition is going to be really fierce. USA, UK, Europe will all fight for the Chinese tourist again to get them back in. And look, even our near neighbours in New Zealand will want more too. So, we're working very hard to do that. Competition will be fierce, and we're well aware of that. But I think we've got a great strategy in place from what we've done in the past, but also the changes and the pivot that we need to do for the future is well in train at the moment.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, thank you both so much for today's session, Andrew and Emma, respectively. I think that's a really important takeaway, that the strengths of Australia's tourism attraction to China doesn't change. So even though, we are experiencing a really difficult time at the moment, the offering of Australia as a travel destination to China in particular remains very strong and will do so when the rebound starts. So just before I end the call today, I'd just like to show some future ACBC events coming up in the next week. So as ACBC as an organisation has also been obviously hit by the impact of the coronavirus. Predominantly, ACBC holds hundreds of events across the country annually. We've been very active digitally over the last few weeks, and we have more events coming available to ACBC members in the future. On the 14th of April, the Victorian branch will be hosting an event about managing mental health in the time of the coronavirus. On the 16th of April, ACBC New South Wales will be discussing wellness in regards to China. I'll be conducting another national briefing next week with the Grattan Institute, looking at the macroeconomic outlook in both Australia and China. And our Queensland branch will have an event on contract disputes and supply chain management next week. So for any of that, as always, please stay close to the ACBC website for any updates there. So again, thank you all for joining the call today, in particular Andrew and Emma for your insights. I hope everyone has a great, safe Easter, and we look forward to Chinese tourists coming back to Australia as soon as possible. Thanks everyone, we'll see you next time.
Thank you, bye-bye.